Artificial intelligence means entrepreneurial education now. Here's my question. How do we educate students for jobs that do not exist yet? Now, education is preparation for life, and one's work is a major component of life. Yet the data indicate that the workplace is transforming dramatically. The number of people working in mature and large corporations has declined. Companies that are now at the top of the Fortune 500 list are relative newcomers, and most were entrepreneurial startups over the last generation or so. Advancements in robotics indicate that jobs requiring repetitive manual labor will become fewer, and advancements in artificial intelligence indicate that jobs requiring low-level intellectual labor will also become fewer. So, more people will be working in entrepreneurial firms, and their work will need to be more higher-level cognitive and creative. And at the same time, we educators cannot predict what entrepreneurial firms are going to come into existence in this generation, or what specific domains of creative and higher level cognitive effort they're going to require. So we educators thus face the challenge of preparing this generation of young people for more demanding kinds of work, to work in more entrepreneurial firms, or even for becoming entrepreneurs themselves. And that poses a philosophical and a strategic challenge for education. And here I mean teachers and parents. How should we do that? All right, that's an overview of my theme. I want to plunge in first with a claim about education as a philosophical enterprise. So my first thesis here is that we are living in revolutionary times. And my second thesis is going to be that in these revolutionary times, they highlight entrepreneurism in education as fundamental. So education is both embedded in life and it is preparatory for life. Now, as embedded in life, its activities are continuous with other life activities. But as preparation for life, its activities are a means to an end. And once we've identified in principle, those means do have an intrinsic integrity of their own. But human beings are human beings, so the same general principles of education apply universally. The good we share in common is that each of us needs to think, learn, and then act on the basis of our thinking to produce the values that make human life possible and worthwhile. But in revolutionary eras, we are each presented with unique opportunities, and revolutionary eras put special demands upon all of us. So our era is characterized by dramatic increases in life expectancy, greater productivity, wealth creation on an unbelievable scale, the reduction of poverty, increases in entrepreneurial aspiration and quality of life expectations, what we want to get out of our lives, and the accelerating developments in robotics and artificial intelligence and other high-tech intensive domains. Consequently, we as parents, we as teachers, and most importantly, if we are students ourselves, young people especially, we can and must rethink what education is all about. Now, my theme is entrepreneurism, and by entrepreneurism, I mean a generalization upon entrepreneur. So we're familiar with the entrepreneur as a person who has an independent vision for a business, the person who shows initiative in starting it, and usually with much trial and error and self-driven perseverance, succeeds in bringing a valuable product or service to the market. Now, the entrepreneurism is derived by abstracting the entrepreneur's traits of independence, initiative, trial and error, perseverance, and creative success, and then applying them to life as a whole. Becoming and being entrepreneurial, not only in one's economic life, but also in one's scientific life, religious life, artistic life, social life in general. So the phrase, "you are the entrepreneur of your life," has special relevance in our times, these revolutionary times. So here's my hypothesis about the revolutionary times. The modern world is unique in human experience. Now, by the modern world, I mean the last 500 years, beginning with the generation straddling year 1500 in the Common Era. Now, that generation straddling 1500 includes such individuals as Leonardo da Vinci, Christopher Columbus, Michelangelo, Martin Luther, Nicholas Copernicus, and Andreas Vesalius. And if we consider their huge impacts on engineering, exploration, art, religion, the physical, and the human sciences. Now, from a perspective of an individual's lifetime, 5 centuries seems like an enormously long time, but it is brief in the broad span of human history. Anthropologists, they estimate that Homo sapiens have existed for approximately 300,000 years. So the modern world then, 500 years, includes maybe 1.5% of human experience. For the other and the prior 98.5%, humans did educate themselves and they educated their young. Yet the transformations of the human condition over the past 500 years have dramatically altered human actuality and potentiality. So let's consider one piece of evidence, and I'm now looking at a chart showing gross domestic product for the world as a whole over the past 2,000 years. Now, what this chart shows, and it's a kind of a hockey stick chart, is that human productivity was low. This is now in Western historical terms, but applies to the world as a whole. From the end of the Roman Republic and the lifetime of Jesus, approximately 2,000 years ago, through about year 1500. So 1,500 years of that, humans are not making very much stuff as a whole. Around 1500, we can see it starts a modest rate increase. Now, that rate of increase then increases during the 1600s, and it becomes exponential in the 1700s. We humans were modestly productive, for the vast majority of our existence, yet in the modern world, we can and have become hugely productive. Now, we can ask all the fascinating causal questions. Why did that happen? Why did it happen when it happened and not earlier? Why did it first happen in some places in the world and then later in other parts? And some standard explanations, of course, include the Industrial Revolution, 1700s, in which a culture of mechanical innovation and the discovery of high-yield energy sources enabled mass production. Other standard explanations include the scientific revolution of the 1500s and the 1600s, in which a culture of observation, experimentation, logical and mathematical analysis opened up new vistas of investigation and dramatically expanded our stock of knowledge. The artistic revolution of the 1400s and 1500s, in which naturalistic and humanistic methods and themes came to predominate. Other explanations include religious revolutions of the 1500s through the 1700s, which, after much individual searching, vigorous debate, and a significant amount of violence, but eventually out of that came a culture of religious toleration and the institutional separations of church and state. Other explanations include political and economic revolutions of the 1600s and the 1700s in first Britain, America, and France, and those undercut all of the traditional class-based feudal understandings of the state, and instead we saw the modern development of states characterized by democratic, republican, and market-friendly institutions. Also, standard explanations include all of the social revolutions of the 1700s and 1800s that elevated women to having the same liberties and other rights as men, and that challenged and overthrew the ages-old institution of slavery. Now, if we take all of these revolutions happening over the course of 200 or 300 years and we put them all together, the integrating hypothesis is going to be that human productivity exploded as a result of pushing to extend freedom and equality to human beings universally, as intrinsic values shared by all human beings, all individuals in common, those more free and more tolerant humans using increasingly science and technology entrepreneurially to make their lives better. Now, overall productivity is one measure. We can always ask whether those productivity gains are distributed across the population. That's another question. So I'm now looking at some charts showing poverty reduction over the last 2 centuries. And again, the changes are dramatic and revolutionary, from 90, 95%, 98%, depending on where you are in the world, of the world living in extreme poverty, and then relatively quickly, and quickly here means a couple of centuries, that number declining to 10%, less than 10%, 1 or 2% in the richer parts of the world. Another chart that I'm looking at now shows the dramatic increases in life expectancy over just, say, the last 250 years. Now, in part, of course, these are made possible by the increases in productivity and the correlate reductions in overall poverty. But when we look at the life expectancy data, what we find is in many places of the world, minimally a doubling, and in some places a more than doubling of life expectancies. Average life expectancy going from the 20s and 30s to the 70s and on into the 80s. Now, I'm thinking about education today, and since education is embedded in life, these revolutionary changes to our living conditions, they have immediate implications for education. How one thinks about life when one is poor and expects to be poor is different from how one thinks about life when one is rich or expects that becoming rich is a possibility or even a likelihood. Education is also a preparation for life. How one plans for life when life expectancy is 30 or 40 years is different from how one plans for 80 to 90 years of life. And for young people especially, when one has more time to do what one wants, and one has more resources available to do what one wants, then the phrase, "you are the entrepreneur of your life," becomes an increasingly realistic aspiration. Now, for educators, especially parents, teachers, and education entrepreneurs. Now, we of course can recognize that humans' biological identities are basically the same now as they were 500, 5,000, 50,000 years ago. Yet, humans' cultural circumstances now are mostly revolutionized. That requires a corresponding mind shift in how educators think and plan.
You're listening to Open College on the Possibly Correct Network with renowned philosopher and author Dr. Stephen Hicks, a podcast to explain the chaos, taking an in-depth look into how postmodernism is affecting the modern world and your lives without you even realizing it. Stay up to date with the latest releases and news from Dr. Hicks by following the podcast on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Minds.com and Gab, or sign up to our email list at www.opencollegepodcast.com. While you're online, please show your support for the podcast by leaving a review on your chosen media player. Now back to the podcast.
Now, I want to contrast work then and work now. So work then means prior to the modern world. Work now means, broadly speaking, in the modern world. In tribal and feudal economies, think about what work meant. Well, making a living was hard and mostly a matter of adapting oneself to functions that had already been pre-established. Boys learned to do man things, girls learned to do woman things. Most individuals were born into a specific place in a social hierarchy, and those hierarchies were regularly rigidified into feudal caste structures, and the individuals had little mobility. Children of peasants remained peasants, children of artisans became artisans, and children of aristocrats became aristocrats. Now, come the modern world, though, tribal and feudal organizations declined, or they were abolished, and social mobility increased, right? Classes became, by and large, abolished, and they just became arbitrary categories that we can construct as we want, not socially rigid and legally ratified structures to which one is bound. In the modern world, children of peasants frequently became small business owners or executives. Descendants of artisans became professionals. Grandchildren of former aristocrats could be found working at insurance and entertainment companies. For boys and girls both, the new technologies and the new values first blurred and then made absolutely irrelevant most distinctions between men's work and women's work. What any individual child could come to be as an adult became increasingly open-ended. The economic growth also increases. The quantity and the types of jobs increase for those who wish to take jobs. So there's lots more jobs out there and lots of different kinds of jobs out there than before. The increased wealth and freedom also means more of those people who want to make their own jobs can do so. So one feature of the current work culture in the modern world, especially as we get further into the modern world, is the rise of entrepreneurial aspiration. For an increasing number of young people, the realistic question has become, do I wish to take a job at an existing business, or do I wish to start a new business and make my own job? All right. Now, let's focus next on turnover at the biggest companies. Now, we can all go to work for any of the biggest companies that are out there, and lots of big companies out there. But notice this statistic from Stephen Rogers, who's a business professor at Harvard University. He's studied employment in kind of the established sectors and the entrepreneurial employment sectors in the United States. One key indicator across time, this is the last century or so, but I've got statistics for the last half century, is employment at Fortune 500 companies. Fortune is the business magazine that publishes statistics annually on the 500 largest companies in the United States. And since the United States is the world's largest economy, it is representative of and pushes leading economic trends. So here's a quotation from Professor Rogers. Quote, "In the 1960s, 1 out of every 4 persons in the United States worked for a Fortune 500 company. Today is the year 2002. That was 40 years after the 1960s, but only 1 out of 14 people works for these companies. Employment at Fortune 500 companies peaked at 16.5 million people, 1979, and has declined every year to approximately 10.5 million people today. Again, that's 2,000 years. So what we see from the 1960s to the early 2000s is a decline in the proportion of people who are working at Fortune 500 companies, the larger established corporations. And that trend has continued over the next generation, bringing us into the 2020s now. So, one kind of employment is to work for a large and long-established corporation. Now, such businesses typically have a bureaucracy. They have established ways of doing things. Yet, the trend is for relatively fewer Americans to be working in such companies. The decline from 25% to 7% of employment numbers in the course of one generation, that's a significant shift. And what that means is that relatively more workers are finding employment in smaller and more entrepreneurial organizations. And the culture of smaller and more entrepreneurial organizations is typically much less bureaucratic and less beholden to established methods of doing things. So, a further factor emerges when you ask, well, what companies are we talking about when we look at the Fortune 500? And there's a lot of churn here. That list changes dramatically over time. And I'm now looking at a pair of charts that shows the top 10 companies in the year 2000 and the top 10 in the year 2020. So that's a 20-year shift. So here are the top 10 companies in the year 2000. Top 10 in the Fortune 500. Number 1, General Motors. Number 2, Walmart. Number 3, ExxonMobil. Number 4, Ford Motor Company. General Electric. Number 6, International Business Machines, IBM. Number 7, Citigroup. Number 8, AT&T. Number 9, Philip Morris. Number 10, the Boeing Company. Now, I'm going to read off the list 20 years later. Here are the top 10 companies in the U.S. on the Fortune 500. Number 1, Walmart. Number 2, Amazon. Number 3, Apple. Number 4, CVS Health. Number 5, United Health Group. Number 6, Berkshire Hathaway. Number 7, McKesson. Number 8, AmerisourceBergen. Number 9, Alphabet. That's the parent company of Google. Number 10, ExxonMobil. Now here's the cool thing. The significant fact is 80% of the top 10 companies in 2000 have fallen off the list by year 2020. The exceptions are Walmart, which moved from second place to first place, and Exxon, which declined from third place to 10th place. The other 8 companies no longer appear that's from the 2000 list. They're not in the top 10 anymore. They've been replaced in the top 10 by companies such as Amazon, Alphabet, again, that's the parent company of Google, Apple, and so on. So also important is that many of the currently biggest companies did not exist a generation ago, or they existed, but they were young and in their entrepreneurial phase. So Amazon was founded in 1994. Google was founded in 1998. Apple is older. It was founded in 1976, but it's gone through boom and bust phases in its 50-year existence, skyrocketing to third place on the 2020 list after these major transformations. Now, this trend churn among Fortune 500s is perhaps accelerating, as 50% of the top 10 companies in 1960 dropped off the top 10 list by 1980. And then again, 50% of the top 10 companies in the year 1980 dropped off the list by the year 2000. So the takeaway point here, and this is for us as entrepreneurial educators to think about, is entrepreneurial churn continues to alter the employment landscape dramatically. And this indicates, once again, a need for a mind shift among students and educators. It is one thing to prepare for employment in companies that have existed for a long time with established bureaucracies. It is another to prepare for employment at innovative organizations that are characterized by entrepreneurism. Or even more aspirationally, to think of education as preparation to become an entrepreneur who will create one of those innovative organizations. Now, suppose we educators, or those of us who are interested in education, we look to the future and we predict this trend of turnover among Fortune 500 companies is going to continue. What that implies is that on the year 2040, sounds science fiction future, but it's not that far away. The next 20 years, so to speak, that will contain companies that do not yet exist. Or that the 2040 list will contain companies that are currently small and have only recently come into existence. Furthermore, if the historical pattern of innovation continues, there will be ongoing revolutions and significant evolutions in the sciences, in engineering, and in the entrepreneurial sector of the business world. And many new companies will be formed on the basis of those innovations. What that means, right now, as I am talking, making this podcast, innovative people are generating ideas, starting companies that will revolutionize the economy in the same way that the current Fortune 500 companies did over the past 20 years. So here again, we're looking at the challenge for us educators. Now, we have little to no idea what these companies will be, yet we know that those new companies will become the employers of large numbers of our current young students. We are parents, teachers, professors of education. We're administrators of educational institutions. We're government officials reforming education policy. Or we are entrepreneurs starting new kinds of education institutions. And as always, we have to ask, how should we think about education to prepare students for their work life? Now, that's only part of our task, as education is preparing students for their life in general. But work careers are a large and an embedded part of life in general. Just a few hundred years ago, education meant preparing the majority of young people to be farmers or skilled craftspeople in a guild, or for a small minority of them to be members of the clergy or the aristocracy. Those roles all had been defined over the course of centuries or millennia and were, for educators, stable and known phenomena. 100 years ago, education meant preparing a majority of people to work in a factory or an office. And the assumption often was that the graduated student would start working for a company and work there for decades until retirement. Yet, the new economy is more entrepreneurial, more innovative, and more revolutionary. And if that is true, those historical assumptions about education no longer apply. We educators need to be as entrepreneurial as the economy is.
Friedrich Nietzsche was famous for his statement that God is dead, and his provocative account of master and slave moralities, and also for the fact that Adolf Hitler and the Nazis claimed that Nietzsche was one of their great inspirations. Were the Nazis right to do so, or did they misappropriate Nietzsche's philosophy? Professor Stephen Hicks' concisely written book, Nietzsche and the Nazis, based on the 2006 documentary, corrects many widespread misconceptions about Nietzsche, giving a fascinating and easy-to-understand analysis of Nietzsche's work, asking and answering a number of questions, such as what were the key elements of Hitler and the National Socialist political philosophy? How did the Nazis come to power in a nation as educated and civilized as Germany? What was Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophy? The philosophy of live dangerously, and that which does not kill us makes us stronger? And to what extent did Nietzsche's philosophy provide a foundation for the horrors perpetrated by the Nazis? Professor Hicks demonstrates his mastery of this subject using quotes and critical analysis that prove his points and show the true linkage between Nietzsche and the Nazis and how philosophical ideas move the world. Get your copy of Nietzsche and the Nazis by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com today. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College podcast hosted by Hicks himself on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Now, let's focus on robots and artificial intelligence. Robotics and artificial intelligence. In one sense, neither of them is especially new. Human beings have been clever at making tools and mechanical devices to work for us for a long time. The Industrial Revolution of the 1700s was a major increase in the sophistication of those machines, as well as in the availability of large-scale energy sources to power them. So then, just to follow one line of development, Electricity in the late 1800s revolutionized everything. Electronics in the mid-1990s revolutionized, and the internet taking off in the years just before year 2000. So what will the middle part of the 2000s bring? Or, to take another example, the automobile industry. In 1980, General Motors and Ford were in the top 10 Fortune list. Chrysler was 17th. Other huge car manufacturers around the world included Japan's Toyota, Nissan, Germany's BMW, Volkswagen. Those companies made cars by means of hundreds of human beings arrayed along a complicated assembly line. Now picture an assembly line in a car manufacturer. Car assembly lines have few to no human beings, but only a series of robots performing every specific task in the making of an automobile. Now, many of our young students are not interested in the academic life, agriculture, or office work. They like to make things, and a generation ago they would have had good careers working smart with their hands in the big factories. Yet, the new generation of more sophisticated robots can increasingly perform almost any relatively simple mechanical repetitive function. So the blue collar, so to speak, employment sector, that is to say people who work with their hands primarily, is being transformed. Same thing holds for artificial intelligence. Again, in one sense, artificial intelligence is an old story. Thinking machines, calculating machines are now several decades old, from primitive computers to sophisticated business machines to personal computers to smartphones. Now, setting aside philosophical debates about real versus artificial intelligence, the applied issue is that software programs of many sorts, basic algorithms, search, semantic engines, machine learning, transcription, individualized voice recognition, translation, and so on, are performing increasingly sophisticated functions. And all of that has implications for the so-called white-collar employment landscape, people who work in offices. Now, recent generations of students could expect to train for and to find work as, say, typists, right, or as bookkeepers, librarians, translators, medical transcriptionists, basic editors, paper form processing, law clerks researching precedents, and so on. Now, how many of those careers will exist in 20 years? Now, that's to focus on the negative, the disappearance of existing jobs and careers. The positive, though, is to think of their replacements or expansions. What new careers will come into existence as a result of the new robotics and AI? So just as educators in early 1900, so go back to the year 1900, could you imagine your students growing up to work as film editors, as jet engine mechanics, or software coders? No, that would be impossible to us. But we educators in the early 2000s, we cannot imagine next century's not yet existing careers. So this is the entrepreneurial educator's challenge, and I want to summarize it. We educators cannot simply think in terms of preparing our students to work in known existing companies, performing known existing functions. Many of those current companies will shrink in size and or go out of existence, and many of those current functions will no longer be performed by humans. At the same time, we know that new companies and new functions will come into existence, but we don't know precisely what those companies or those functions are. Yet those are the companies our students will be creating and working for. And our responsibility as educators is somehow to prepare our students for them. That is to say, we live in an entrepreneurial economy, and our students need to be entrepreneurial. So we educators ourselves need to be entrepreneurial. And I like to think of the key question for us as entrepreneurs, or education entrepreneurs, this way. How do we prepare our students to create new companies doing new things, or to prepare them to work for companies or jobs that do not yet exist? That's the hard question. That's also the exciting question, and that's our central question for educators of our generation. Now, I want to suggest an answer to that question before I close. And one way to look at this is to ask what already entrepreneurial employers want. So a suggested answer to that question, I'm drawing on a survey of executives in corporations and human resource managers who hire large numbers of recent graduates. And the designers of this survey asked the participant executives and HR managers this question: what skills and traits do you look for when making a new hire? Now, that question generated a long list of answers: desirable traits and skills, organization skills, teamwork, media literacy, STEM knowledge, that's science, technology, engineering, math, written communication skills, verbal communication skills, critical thinking, and so on. So a dream list for your ideal employee. The survey designers, though, went further, asking the participants to array that list in two further ways. What are your desirable skills and traits? But look at that list of traits and then ask two additional questions. Which of those skills or traits are essential in your decision to hire? As to say, absolutely essential, not just nice to have, but the person has to have those things or you're not going to hire them. The second question was, which of those skills and traits are easy to find in potential employees? So you interview 100, 200 potential employees. Which skills or traits do most or all of them have, and which ones, by contrast, do you not find very frequently in those employees? Now, what the survey designers then did was charted those responses to question 1 and question 2 along a horizontal axis and a vertical axis. And so we ended up with a 2x2 chart. So we can imagine 4 quadrants on this 2x2 matrix or chart. There would be things that are not particularly essential and pretty easy to find, those traits among prospective employees. Or we could find things that are not very essential, but they're still kind of hard to find. Right? And then another quadrant would be things that are relatively easy to find and essential. And then the fourth quadrant, and this one on the chart was in the upper right, these are things that are both essential and very difficult to find in prospective employees. Only 2 things made it into that upper right quadrant, things that were both essential to employers and difficult to find. Those 2 things were critical thinking and problem solving. So media literacy, for example, that's valuable, but this survey told us is not particularly important to major employers, and it was easy to find in their employee candidates. Quantitative ability, kind of math skills, that was more important to them, though not a lot more important, and that one turned out to be very difficult to find among employee candidates. The ability to work with others of diverse backgrounds, that was pretty important to employers, more important than media literacy, more important than quantitative ability, but it was also pretty easy to find among employee candidates. So the upper right quadrant of things that are essential and difficult to find, that is the most important challenge for us as educators. Those then are the students we want to produce. And if we are a student, that's the kind of graduate we want to become. Because if we can acquire those traits and skills, then we are creating graduates and becoming graduates who have what it takes from the perspective of employees, what they need, and we will then be standing out in the market. So what we then should be focusing on is critical thinking and problem solving. Those 2 traits are simultaneously the skills and traits that entrepreneurs and the entrepreneurial need most. being creative in your thinking, being able to solve problems, particularly new problems or existing and somewhat intractable problems in different ways. Those are classic top traits among the entrepreneurial. But they are also the traits that are going to give human beings their best comparative advantage in the marketplace and their best comparative advantage relative to robotics and developments in artificial intelligence. So what this implies for me, and I'm going to wrap things up here, is that for strategic thinking about education, what we should be doing is, of course, we have a long list of things that we want our students to know, and our ambitious students know that they need to acquire a lot of skills, knowledge, and habits and so forth. But at the top of the list should be critical thinking and problem solving. That means that when we're making our major strategic decisions about the curriculum, about instructional methods, about the kinds of teachers we're going to hire, what assessment tools we're going to use, every other aspect of education should be tied directly to this desired educational outcome. Graduating students who are proficient critical thinkers and problem solvers. Now, those graduates are going to be best positioned to embrace the opportunities and to face the challenges of our revolutionary, innovative, entrepreneurial times. They will be the competent human beings who can be the founders of entrepreneurial companies themselves, or they can be the kind of employees who will succeed within entrepreneurial companies. They also will be the resilient human beings who can, at the least, outcompete the new developments in robotics and artificial intelligence so as to keep their jobs, or at the best even to use and even devise the next generation robots and the artificial intelligence in creating their own flourishing careers and lives. We entrepreneurial educators, if we rise to that challenge, then can say to our students, you are the entrepreneur of your life, and make good on our happy responsibility of making that potentiality that all young people have actualized.